The Arctic Ocean is not a single landscape. It is a moving surface, fractured into fields that press and separate with the wind. In late summer, the light can still be long, but the sea already carries a cold authority. The water looks dark between flows. The ice looks pale, often ridged, sometimes smooth, always in motion. A ship in that environment is never simply traveling. It is negotiating with pressure. In 1937, 3 Soviet icebreaking steamers, Sedov, Sadko, and Malagin, were working in the high latitudes above Siberia when the season closed earlier than expected. Their work included oceanographic and hydrological observation in Arctic seas tied to the Northern Sea route. The Sedov in particular was operating in the Laptev Sea during that year's program of measurements. The plan assumed that the ships would withdraw before the pack consolidated. The ice did not follow the plan. By October 1937, the 3 ships were icebound. On October 23, according to later reporting, the Sedov became fast in the ice as well, joining the Sadko and Malagin in a forced wintering. The immediate environment tightened around them. The flows that had been navigable lanes became a continuous sheet. Pressure ridges formed where plates collided. The noise of it was mechanical and irregular, as if the sea itself were a shifting structure. The ships were not sinking. They were being held. At first, a wintering in place could be framed as delay rather than disaster. The Soviet Arctic program of the 1930s treated the North not only as a frontier but as a working corridor. Since 1932, the Soviet state had organized administration and infrastructure for regular navigation along the Northern Sea route. It involved new polar stations, radio communication, port development, and a growing icebreaker fleet. These efforts were intended to link European Russia with the Pacific through Arctic waters, shortening routes that otherwise required long passages via southern oceans. The ships in 1937 were part of that long strategy, and their immobilization quickly became politically visible. The physical problem, however, was simple. In the Arctic, the ice does not merely block a ship. It carries it. Once a vessel is frozen into a flow, it becomes part of the drifting pack. That drift is not random. It follows winds, currents, and the broader circulation patterns of the polar basin. If the ice remains intact, a trapped ship can travel hundreds or thousands of miles without running its engines. The direction may change abruptly when the pack reorganizes. The speed can slow to almost nothing in calm periods, then quicken when storms drive the ice. Over months, it becomes a journey measured by latitude and longitude rather than distance traveled under power. Through the winter of 1937 to 1938, the 3 ships remained embedded. By March 2, 1938, Time reported that the Sedov had drifted northward and eastward, then the drift shifted, carrying the ships northwest toward the pole. The change was not a decision made aboard ship. It was the ocean's movement, transmitted through ice. The ships could only record it. A rescue by air was attempted in the spring of 1938. Aircraft could reach the ships over the ice, but they could not release them. Air support could move people, mail, selected equipment, and information. It could not alter the pack. In August 1938, the icebreaker Yermak reached the drifting ships, which by that time were around latitude 83 degrees north, and led Sadko and Malagin out to open water. Sedov could not follow. Her steering had been seriously damaged. The rudder and stern structure were compromised, and the ship was not fit for controlled navigation in heavy ice. The decision was made to leave Sedov in the pack and convert her into a drifting research platform rather than attempt a risky tow or a forced escape attempt that could destroy the hull. This was the point at which an operational delay became a systematic survival problem. A drifting station is, by definition, dependent on continuity, fuel management, food discipline, routine maintenance, and the careful prevention of avoidable injury. It also requires time to be made predictable through schedules, because the environment provides no natural structure besides day length and weather. For Sedov, the drift would continue not for weeks but for 812 days. She would travel over the top of the world, reaching a farthest north of about 86°39 N. She would cross and recross regions once traversed by Fridtjof Nansen's from decades earlier, creating an unplanned scientific comparison between two eras of polar drift. The crew left aboard Sedov was reduced to a small group. In some accounts it is described as 14 men, in others as 15. The exact number varies by source, and the discrepancy is worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. The essential fact is consistent: a small team, selected for stamina and function, remained on a damaged ship embedded in sea ice, tasked with maintaining the vessel, conducting scientific observations, and wading through an Arctic night that would arrive and depart on the schedule of latitude rather than human need. Once Sedov was committed to the drift, the environment began to dictate the terms. In mid-October in those latitudes, the sun drops low and then stops rising. The surface temperature can move quickly with wind and cloud. Visibility can be reduced to a few ship lengths during blowing snow. The ship structure becomes a warm island surrounded by a plain that is neither stable land nor open sea. The ice can crack underfoot without warning, forming leads that expose black water. When pressure builds, the pack can ridge up into walls. None of it is constant. The survival work begins before the failure becomes dramatic. Food and fuel are separated into reserves. Supplies are cached on the ice in case the ship must be abandoned quickly. This is not an act of panic. It is standard Arctic caution. In one reported episode during the drift, the ice pressure increased, and men at a tent depot fired a warning shot. The crew moved across the ice, and the tent was crushed by an advancing heap. The men survived, but they spent hours recovering food and fuel and relocating the depot. The lesson was blunt and repeatable: supplies stored on the ice were vulnerable to the same forces that held the ship. There was no safe storage, only better choices and constant vigilance. The decision to leave Georgiy Sedov in the ice was not framed as abandonment in official language. It was framed as conversion. A ship with a damaged steering system could still serve a purpose if it remained intact. The ice itself would supply motion. The crew's work would supply meaning. In Soviet terms of the 1930s, endurance and utility were closely linked. Once Yermak had led Sadko and Malagin out in August 1938, Sedov drifted alone. The WHOI historical summary describes the essential mechanics. Her steering was seriously damaged, she could not get out of the ice, and she was converted into a drifting research platform. The drift continued for 812 days. The ship reached as far north as 86°39 N and eventually drifted out into the Greenland Sea in January 1940. A drifting ship is not a stationary camp. It is a moving camp with an unstable perimeter. Every routine has to account for the ice shifting underfoot. The immediate threats are rarely cinematic. They are ordinary: frostbite, fuel rationing, broken fittings, injuries from manual labor, and the possibility that a pressure ridge will crack the flow or force the hull against ice in a way the ship cannot tolerate. The time account of the drift, written with the tone of its era, still offers concrete details about what daily hazard looked like. Food and fuel were cached in tents across the ice in case the crew had to abandon ship suddenly. In one episode, the ice began grinding harder than usual. A warning shot was fired from the hydrographic tent, and the crew ran across the ice. As they arrived, an ice heap moved in and buried the tent. The men escaped, then worked for hours digging out cases of food and barrels of fuel oil and hauling them to a new depot. The event is not presented as a single dramatic turning point. It is presented as an expected consequence of living on moving ice. That is the logic of systematic survival. You do not wait for the crisis. You assume it is coming. You place your supplies where they can be recovered even after damage. You create redundancy. You train people to replace each other in observation work. You establish a cadence so that days do not dissolve into fatigue and improvisation. The crew also worked. The drift did not suspend the mission. The WHOI summary notes a range of observations, soundings that revealed greater depths than previously thought, year-round meteorological records in the high Arctic, and systematic ice and snow measurements, taken every 10 days. It also notes a conclusion drawn from that body of observation: the weather in the high Arctic proved less severe than at its margins. That is an empirical claim, not a poetic one, and it was part of the scientific value of the drift. In the IPY Arctic Portal account, which draws on published works about the expedition, the scientific effort is described with practical constraints. It states that there was only one man aboard with formal scientific training, hydrographer V.K. Bynitsky, and that equipment was limited to what was brought from Sadko. Even under those limits, the crew organized a full program of observations, astronomical, magnetic, and gravity measurements, meteorology, ice thickness, and soundings. The implication is not that the work was perfect, but that it was continuous. Continuity, in long Arctic survival, becomes a form of safety. A crew that works on schedule is less likely to drift into disorder. The drift itself changed direction over time. Time reported that by March 2, 1938, the flow drift had shifted toward the northwest, toward the pole. Later, it described the ship's farthest north in February 1939 at 85°56'42" N, and then drift beyond the 86th parallel. Its narrative notes that later the drift carried the ship away from the pole, west by south, and eventually southward. These shifting vectors are consistent with what is known about Arctic ice circulation, where winds can temporarily override currents and where the transpolar drift can carry ice out through the Firm Strait toward the Greenland Sea. The crew's survival conditions included scarcity of contact. The Arctic is empty in a practical sense. In summer, there may be open leads and more visible bird life. In winter, the world compresses into darkness and wind. Time notes long intervals with little wildlife observed, and it records that the crew shot and ate a polar bear. That detail is not unique to this expedition, it is a known practice in polar survival when other meat is limited. The factual importance lies in its ordinariness. A bear is not hunted for drama. It is hunted for calories, fat, and fuel for the body. There were also repairs. Time describes the crew working through spring to repair the steering gear, enabling partial control of the ship's movements by June. A ship embedded in ice cannot be piloted like a ship in open water, but a repaired system could matter if open water appeared or if the ship needed to orient its hull against pressure. In the Arctic, orientation can be the difference between riding pressure and being crushed by it. The sources do not provide a full technical log of repairs, so the specific mechanical methods should not be overstated. What can be said, factually, is that repair work was ongoing and was treated as essential. The political frame around the drift changed over time. In Time's account, the Soviet press later presented the drift as a national adventure story, with goals including approaching or surpassing Nansen's firm record. The same article describes administrative consequences and public messaging. Those details belong to political history rather than survival technique, but they shaped how the crew's situation was interpreted and supported. In practical terms, political attention could mean continued radio contact, a commitment to eventual recovery, and an institutional refusal to write the ship off. For the men aboard, daily life was still governed by the ice. A schedule of observations meant leaving the ship and crossing the floe to measurement sites. The risks were consistent. A crack could open between the ship and a tent depot. Wind could erase tracks. Cold could turn a simple task into a medical emergency. Darkness could make a familiar perimeter unfamiliar. What point of no return looks like in this kind of incident is not a single moment of impact. It is the moment the last practical exit disappears. For Sedov, that moment came when Sadko and Malagin were let out in August 1938 and Sedov remained, steering damaged, committed to the drift. From then on, there was no route home that depended on the ship's engines. Home would arrive only when the ice carried the ship to a region where another vessel could reach it, or when the ship drifted into less consolidated waters and could be brought under control. The Arctic night returned. The ship moved into latitudes where the sun's behavior becomes unfamiliar to lower latitudes. The IPY account describes the sun peeking over the horizon for the last time in mid-October as the ship drifted north of the 84th parallel, and it notes that it would be 4.5 months before it returned. Whether the exact duration varies slightly by latitude and specific position, the broader reality remains: for months, time is kept by clocks and routines rather than sunrise. In that absence of normal time cues, the crew's structured work became survival architecture. Meteorological readings, ice measurements, soundings, maintenance checks, ration accounting, and radio schedules. The ship's interior spaces had to be kept usable. Condensation had to be managed. Heating and fuel had to be controlled. The sources do not list every procedure, and where they do not, a documentary script must stay within what can be supported, that the crew maintained routine scientific and operational work through the drift, and that their supplies were managed with the assumption that pressure or abandonment could occur. By late 1939, the drift was carrying Sedov southward. Time describes a fissure in the ice near the ship on December 3 and hummocks piling up, indicating renewed pressure activity. In Moscow, it reports, the decision was made to retrieve the crew, and the icebreaker J. Stalin, also rendered as Joseph Stalin in English, was ordered to go to their aid. Part 3, 1300 words, the relief operation was not a sudden arrival. It was a long approach through winter sea conditions. According to Time's account, the icebreaker J. Stalin left Murmansk on December 15 and fought gales and ice fields until January 5, when it sighted Sedov. It then took 10 more days to force a path through to the drifting ship. The arithmetic of that approach is itself a survival fact. Distance in polar seas is often measured by resistance, not miles. The last phase was mechanical and slow. Time reports that crews had to heat Sedov's hull and use dynamite to break up an ice cup holding the ship, several thousand tons of ice locked around her, before the final mass could be torn away. The image is not metaphor. In heavy ice, a vessel can be gripped so tightly that it must be freed by altering the ice itself, not by applying engine power. This is the closing movement of a long ordeal, not triumph, but release. After months and then years in which Sedov was effectively part of the pack had to be broken open around her, piece by piece, until the ship could be moved as a ship again. Even then, the way out was narrow. Time describes a corridor between cyclones during the return, emphasizing that weather remained a factor even after the ice had been breached. The end of the drift is recorded in multiple ways across sources. The WHOI historical summary states that Sedov drifted out into the Greenland Sea in January 1940. The IPY Arctic Portal account also states she came out into the Greenland Sea in January 1940 after an 812-day drift of roughly 3,800 miles. Time provides a more specific narrative timeline and then states that on January 29, the ship was eased to dockside in Murmansk, just 959 days after she had set sail in 1937. The difference between 812 days and 959 days reflects different measurement windows. 812 days refers to the period held fast in ice, while the longer figure includes broader voyage time. A documentary script should not collapse these numbers into one. They are describing related but different spans. Some sources also give a specific rescue date. Search results and general references commonly state that the icebreaker Iosif Stalin, Joseph Stalin, freed Sedov on January 18, 1940. This detail appears, for example, in the commonly cited summary on the vessel's reference page. Because that page was not one of the crawled primary texts here, and because encyclopedic pages can compress events, it should be treated as supportive rather than definitive in tone. What we can state with confidence from the primary narratives used is, the rescue and tow occurred in January 1940, with sighting around January 5 and docking in Murmansk by January 29 per time. The most important survival fact about the Sedov drift is not that the ship endured ice pressure. Many ships have endured ice pressure and still been lost. The decisive fact is continuity. A small crew maintained the vessel and themselves through nearly 27 months embedded in moving ice, with supplies managed under risk of crushing, and with daily routines adapted to darkness and cold. In the WHOI historical summary, the drift is explicitly associated with scientific gain, soundings showing greater depths than previously believed, year-round meteorological observations indicating less severe weather than at Arctic margins, systematic ice and snow measurements every 10 days, and comparability with other drifting stations that were operating in the same era. These are not side notes. They explain why the ship was kept in place instead of being abandoned. It was not only a matter of saving lives, though that mattered. It was also an effort to extract data from the forced drift, turning the Arctic's control into a measured program. The IPY Arctic Portal account adds further detail about the drift's geographic meaning. It notes that Sedov crossed the course of Nansen's from several times, enabling comparisons across decades. It also states that the ship's sounding suggested greater ocean depths than earlier measurements had indicated. It describes the crew's limited scientific staffing and equipment, and the training of other crew members to assist with meteorological and ice work. This is the practical method of survival through specialization under constraint. One trained hydrographer does not do everything alone, he establishes tasks others can do reliably. In time's telling, the drift also acquired a symbolic role. Radio messages, anniversaries of the drift, and planned recognition are described. It is not necessary to dramatize those details. They matter as evidence of ongoing contact. A crew that is remembered is more likely to be supplied, more likely to be recovered, and more likely to keep its own discipline. Even a short radio exchange can serve as structure. The crew's personal states are not documented in direct internal monologue. A calm documentary narrator does not invent them. What can be observed, from actions recorded, is function. They cached food and fuel, implying readiness for emergency abandonment. They responded to ice pressure events with speed, implying training and alertness. They maintained observation schedules, implying routine and shared responsibility. They attempted repairs, implying a focus on long-term survivability. None of that requires invented dialogue. When the ship returned, awards were issued, and the drift was incorporated into Soviet Arctic history. The IPY account notes that crewmen were made heroes of the Soviet Union and that the ship received honors, and it mentions later museum association in Arkhangelsk. These are administrative afterlives of a survival event. They indicate the state's interest in the narrative. For the purposes of a survival documentary, the quieter truth remains: a small crew endured an environment that did not permit error for long. If we return to the Arctic itself, the drift can be understood without ideology. The ice does not care about goals. It moves with wind and current. A ship held within it becomes a measure of that movement. The crew's survival depends on recognizing that the environment is not an opponent that can be beaten quickly. It is a system that must be lived within. The Sedov drift demonstrates certain principles that recur across documented polar survival incidents. The first is the primacy of shelter. The ship's hull and heated interior were not optional comforts. They were the difference between survival and exposure. Even when supplies were stored outside, the ship remained the core structure. The second is redundancy. Food and fuel were cached in more than one place. Observation work was distributed. Equipment limitations were addressed by training and routine rather than by improvisation alone. The third is attention to the ice as terrain. The crew treated the floe like ground that could fail. Warning systems, rapid movement, and relocation of depots show an understanding that the ice surface was unstable. The fourth is the discipline of time. In a polar night, routine prevents collapse. The documentary record emphasizes observations made regularly, every 10 days for ice and snow work in one summary, and it emphasizes ongoing scientific tasks. That rhythm is survival strategy as much as science. The resolution of the incident is restrained. The ship was freed and brought to port. The drift ended because another icebreaker reached her and because the ice itself carried her into a region where release was possible. The final days were labor, not spectacle. Heat was applied to steel. Explosives were used against ice. The ship was towed through a corridor of weather. A reflective closing does not need to enlarge the story. It can narrow it to what the drift reveals. A vessel can be immobilized without breaking. A crew can survive without heroics in the theatrical sense, simply through systems, rationing, maintenance, observation, and readiness for evacuation. The Arctic Ocean, in this incident, functioned like a conveyor that could not be stopped and could not be steered for long. The crew's task was to remain viable while it moved. The Georgiy Sedov drift lasted 812 days in the ice. The ship reached a latitude above 86 degrees north. It exited into the Greenland Sea in January 1940. Those numbers are not just records. They are measures of how long routine can hold against cold, pressure, and uncertainty when a crew treats survival as daily work instead of a single dramatic event.